they were working with, how many young people they were working with due to harms outside of the home, and then of those young people, how many were placed out of area because of those risks. So incredibly hard work for the local authorities to do that, and we're forever grateful for them for doing it. We then did follow-up interviews with the professionals who were working in them services to understand the rationale for the relocations. So why are we relocating adolescents in these circumstances? And specifically, we're interested in getting their initial thoughts on how they felt the relocation impacted on safety. And we took a multi-dimensional approach to safety that was developed by Lucy Shuker. So we're asking not just about physical safety, but what's the impact on relationships, so relational safety, and what's the impact on emotional safety? So in the second phase of the research, we took this one step further. So we wanted to really speak to professionals, young people and their parents and carers to understand what's the impact of these relocations. So we recruited these participants from the same local authorities that took part in phase one. And we got a few less than we'd hoped for because this research took place during the first COVID lockdown, unfortunately. But we still managed to speak to 23 people in total, 5 young people, 15 professionals and 3 parents. And we asked them about the impact of relocations on young people's safety, what worked and what were the challenges. Okay. So, as I say, we surveyed 13 local authorities. So this is an approximation of the national scale of the use of relocations. And we asked them, how many young people were you working with in September 2019, where the risk was outside of the home and they were placed at a distance from the local authority because of those risks? So of the 13 local authorities that we surveyed, 2,128 young people were being supported due to extrafamilial risk. And of those 2,128, 215, which is about 10%, were living in out of area placements because of those risks. And 7% of those young people had experienced multiple placement moves, so multiple out of area placements in that month. So that's 1 in 10. So that's quite high, actually. So 1 in 10 adolescents who were being supported due to extrafamilial risk were placed out of area. And Josh McAllister cites this in the Case for Change as well. But there was really significant variation between local authorities. So some relocated no young people, so 0 over the month. And two in particular local authorities, up almost a quarter of every adolescent they were working with due to risk outside of the home was placed out of area. So in terms of the types of relocations, the most frequently used legal basis for a relocation was Section 31 care order, and that accounted for 90 of the 215. Residential children's homes were the most frequently used form of out of area placement, roughly the same number of young people. And 17 of the 215 young people were in secure placements on welfare grounds. So we asked professionals in the follow-up interviews, in what circumstances are you relocating young people? And across the local authorities, there were some key drivers. One was pressure from other agencies, and the police were particularly named. So the police wanting to move young people out because of pressures on local policing when they're going missing or they're involved in sort of antisocial behaviour. Availability of local placements was another one. But then the most significant driver was just the extent of the physical risk to the young person that just couldn't be managed locally. Interestingly, there was less attention paid to other forms of safety, so sort of the need to build or disrupt relationships or support mental health. So we wanted to understand this variation. Like I said, some local authorities relocated no young people, some relocated up to a quarter. So you might think the variation was driven by the prevalence of extrafamilial harm in different parts of England and Wales, or perhaps by the extent to which local placements were available. However, in the follow-up interviews we conducted, they sort of illustrated that the variation was in fact driven by a complex set of factors. And this included, first of all, the service's strategic view on relocations. So whether they'd made a strategic decision that they do or don't relocate young people, or whether no strategic decision had been taken. Whether services prioritise creating safety or disrupting risk. when responding to extrafamilial harm? And what services targeted when they were responding to extrafamilial harm? So were they targeting the young person and changing something about the behaviour of that young person, or were they targeting the context? So let me talk you through that in a bit more detail. So we divided the local authorities into 3 groups. So group 1 relocated 0 to 5%, group 2 relocated 5 to 10% of young people, and group 3 had the higher number, so 10 to 25. In group 1, a strategic decision had been made not to relocate young people. So we don't relocate our young people was the decision. And there'd been significant investment in local alternatives, so things like local placements and educare services. For group 2, there was no strategic decision had been made, and there was sort of an ambivalence among professionals as to the circumstances in which they would be used or whether they were effective or not. And a lot of professionals in that group said it was sort of a last resort when there were no other options. For the third group, they said that relocations were used when the risk was very significant. Placement availability was a big driver of them needing to place out of their local area, but also it was seen as an essential intervention in response to extrafamilial risk. So professionals from Group 1 services all described, as I said, a strategic desire to reduce relocations. One professional told us, our absolute drive is for children not to be out of area. Out of area is only considered for a small range of reasons. Whereas professionals in Group 2 and Group 3 services rarely described a similar service-wide position on relocations. So instead, as I said, they described using them as a last resort. So one professional said, it's done on risk, and of course, it's always a last resort. Professionals in Group 1 services described efforts to create safety around young people who are experiencing extrafamilial harm. So in particular, they described responding in ways that protected or improved relationships that mattered to young people. They noted in those circumstances that actually relocations often did the opposite, sort of disrupting and breaking important relationships. So one professional said, if you suddenly got planted somewhere else and you didn't know where you were, with no friends, no school or anything, the impact of that must be quite massive. That was a practice manager. Professionals working in the areas with the higher rates of relocation focused more readily on disrupting risk than building safety. So relocation was seen as one way to do that, and in particular disrupting relationships of concern rather than protecting relationships that were safe, either with professionals, family members, friends. And that disruption was seen as a key goal of the intervention. However, those same professionals also described how the disruption-based approach made it difficult for young people to then come back from out-of-area placements and return to their families and communities. So one service manager told us, keeping young people out of area for a long time isn't something that any of us want to do. Sometimes you're not necessarily ready to bring them back. And this was because safety hadn't been created in their absence. So quite a few professionals described it as having being a sigh of relief or being able to sort of take a breath once a young person has been placed out of area, but didn't describe the sorts of activities that then took place in order for that young person to be returned home. And then finally, some of what I've just described was connected to how professionals described the target of the intervention. So professionals from Group 1, so those of the lower levels, targeted relationships whilst also disrupting drivers of harm that were impacting those relationships. So they wanted to protect important relationships, and relocations weren't seen as a good fit for that. Whereas professionals in Group 2 and Group 3 described trying to change young people's behaviour and to protect them from extrafamilial harm, or physically sort of extricating them from the situation and moving them out of the danger. So one professional said, the plan is for him to be relocated in 6 months to break his cycle of offending and to start preparing him for returning. And relocations were well suited to that approach of like giving the young person, taking them out of the situation and working with that young person to change their behaviour. So the varying rates that we identified in this first phase and the apparent reasons for this variation prompted us then to ask, well, what are the conditions in which relocations are a helpful tool in response to extrafamilial harm? And that's what we explored in the next phase. But at that point at which we'd collected the rate data, we did make some recommendations for those overseeing children in care, and that includes IROs. And some of those recommendations from the very initial stage of the research were about creating plans that create safety, as well as are about disrupting risk. Creating plans that protect important relationships, as well as disrupting abusive or harmful relationships. And we also made some recommendations to local and national leaders, and these were around establishing mechanisms for monitoring the use of relocations in response to extrafamilial harm, because none of the local authorities we spoke to were able to tell us how many young people are placed out of area because of risks outside the family. And in doing so, to start to move away from a postcode lottery for young people, where some local areas have a strategic decision that they do relocate, some think it's essential that they don't, and some don't know, and like professionals aren't really sure how they feel about it. Okay, so the recommendations that we made to policymakers based on that first set of findings were around consistent categorising and recording of extrafamilial harm, reportable recording of extrafamilial harm in case management systems, that there was evidence needed about transitions out of placements for extrafamilial harm, so how we bring in young people back, that care planning needs to address contextual risk as well as addressing young people's behaviour. And we also made a recommendation to policing agencies around adopting a shared position on the use of relocation, particularly that has to be driven by the best interests of the child and not by police resources. So in the second phase of the study, we wanted to look a bit more closely at the impact of relocations on professionals, young people and parents and carers. So we did this by carrying out interviews where we asked around the impact of relocations on physical safety, on relational safety, on psychological safety, and we also asked what was helpful and what was unhelpful. So we took a participatory approach to designing the interviews, which was really great actually, and this is one thing that COVID allowed us. So we worked with the Young Researchers Advisory Panel, which is based at the University of Bedfordshire, and that's a group of young people who are experts in informing research on sexual violence, and they worked with me to design some interviews for engaging young people in this phase of the study. It was really invaluable. We designed an activity-based interview where we had an interactive activity that was around thinking about what different forms of safety feel like, examples of different forms of safety, and also a roadmap where young people could mark on a road like different points at which they'd been placed out of area and placement moves, and describe on that journey when they felt safe, when they didn't feel safe. So that was really brilliant and a really great way of designing the data collection. We also engaged a national parent advocacy organisation and consulted with them on how we should design the questions that we would ask parents about the impact of relocations. And they told us that we should start with an open question, that often parents don't get to tell their story. And before we dive in with our specific questions, we should really let parents tell their story. Not to make assumptions about what was helpful or what wasn't helpful, and also recognise that this is really difficult to talk about, and these were really heart-wrenching decisions for parents to make. They also gave us feedback on the clarity and content of the questions. And then finally, we had a stakeholder group of professionals in the area, including policymakers, Ofsted, DfE, academics, managers of residential homes, who gave us feedback on the whole research, but also specifically on the sorts of questions we might ask professionals. So they flagged areas that we'd missed and also gave us feedback on the length and structure of the interviews. So we did the interviews remotely. We asked what helped, what didn't, what was the impact on safety, and I also got a small grant from our funder to provide extra wraparound support, given that we had to do these interviews remotely for young people and parents and carers. So we interviewed 23 people in total, and we thematically analysed the data. So we went through it and pulled out what were the themes across the views of young people, parents and carers and professionals, and we did this analysis in collaboration with young people. Okay, so the idea of this was to establish what are the conditions that support effective relocations, And by looking at the themes, we established that there were 3 major themes that were shared by professionals, young people and parents and carers. And these were quality and consistency of support, suitability of the placement and planning. But there were 2 extra themes that professionals didn't really surface in the interviews, but young people and parents and carers did. And they were around communication and decision making and supporting relationships of family. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about each of those. So in terms of quality and consistency of support, so for young people and their parents, having consistent access to committed professionals provided relationships that they felt supported safety. And professionals also shared that relocations were supported if existing relationships with professionals could be maintained. Professionals also reported that relocations and similarly transitions home from relocations did disrupt supportive relationships, and at times this endangered young people who became isolated in their new location. And transfer issues between local authorities sort of compounded this. So in addition to consistent relationships with professionals, access to services such as education, employment and training and extracurricular activities were also seen as significant. And sometimes relocations disrupted these activities that were really actually very important to young people. Whereas for other young people, they provided opportunities to access better youth provision or have more time to focus on school or go to a better school. And whilst relocations could support educational attainment in some cases by giving them access to the space, basically, to engage with education, young people and professionals also reflected on the significant disruption that multiple moves had on maintaining access to education. And so for parents, interestingly, the issue wasn't consistency of support, but access to support at all. So this applied to the period before, during and after the relocation, with parents sharing that they were either completely excluded from the process, offered unhelpful support that left them feeling unsafe, or were positioned as part of the problem. And parents and professionals reflected that when parents had access to supportive professional relationships, whether that was an advocacy service, whether it was a good relationship with the social worker or a good relationship with the foster carer or residential staff, and they were involved in the plan, that really supported the effectiveness of the move. So just a couple of quotes here from young people and professionals. So we've got one young person here saying, I've got so much books of education books and stuff like that, but I teach myself because I like learning. But the system won't let me go into college and I'm too high risk to go. And that's what's happened because of all the moves and this and that and whatever. So for this young people, the multiple moves meant that she was still struggling to get back into education. In terms of the suitability of the placement, so this will all be, I'm sure, very familiar to you, but professionals shared that low availability of placement sometimes resulted in young people being placed in unsuitable accommodation or accommodation that just didn't match their needs. So parents and young people spoke in more detail, actually, about what made placements feel safe or not, with many speaking about the physical quality of the placement. So the decor, how clean it was, its location, how familiar the location was. One young person spoke about the familiarity of the high street. So there being an Asda and that being familiar because there was an Asda where they were living before, but also whether the staff was supportive or not. Young people and professionals also noted the importance of matching the young person with the environment. So in particular, considering the personality of the young person and the personalities of the other young people in the placement. And for some young people where that didn't work out, the impact was really quite significant. So we've got a comment here from a professional. I suppose they're the children where the greater emphasis is trying to support their safety in a place that they're happy with, because if a child's living in a place where they're unhappy, their safety is compromised straight away by the fact that they don't want to be in that placement. And in fact, we saw lots of young people who went missing from the placement because they didn't like it. So in terms of planning, many participants shared that while the placement was seen to be a last resort response to significantly and rapidly escalating risk, there were few to no alternative attempts made to create safety prior to the move being explored, and the relocation had often been used because there seemed to be just no other option. And while few interviewees identified alternative helpful practices, they just couldn't identify them. Professionals did speak about the necessity of gradual and planned transitions back out of the placement and careful planning in the event of placement breakdown to just avoid cycles of harm where young people were being placed and then they were going missing, and then the placement was breaking down, then they were coming home, then they were going back again. So planning was seen to be really key, but it was often felt by all participants that significant planning around the maintaining of the placement, returning from the placement hadn't taken place, and also exploration of alternatives. So as I said, these last two were themes that were identified by young people and parents and carers, but not by professionals. So for young people, being informed and listened to contributed to how helpful they felt the relocation was and to the extent to which they felt safe. So young people said they felt confused, isolated and worried when they weren't consulted about the plan or the decision to relocate them. For parents, communication and collaboration around the decision to relocate was also critical. These were highly emotive decisions for parents who were under very acute stress when they were describing the circumstances around the relocation, and often whose physical safety was also being compromised by the same risks that the young person was facing. So young parents described wanting to come together over plans for the children to be placed away from home, and this would better support them to make what they described as heart-wrenching decisions that they didn't want to be holding alone, but wanted to be making in collaboration with professionals. So here we've got a parent saying, the initial shock as well when she went into care, when I was told that she'll be in the system until she's 18. And I said, and you were told that, were you? And she said, yeah, that knocked me for 6. I thought that when she's fixed and better, she'd come home, if you know what I mean. So that took a lot of getting my head around. So this was a parent who agreed to the young person going into a placement, but hadn't understood the sort of permanence of that, essentially. And that was something that was sort of retrospectively being unpicked of the social worker. And then finally, supporting relationships with family. So contact with family, and specifically planning around family contact, significantly impacted the extent to which young people and their parents experienced the relocation as effective. So where family contact was prohibited, unsupported, or just restricted by the sheer distance of the placement, this was felt to have short and long-term consequences for families, breaking existing bonds with families that were already under pressure, particularly those of siblings, and having long-term consequences that were sort of compounding the strain that they were already under because of the extrafamilial harm. So the interviews surfaced then tensions between what professionals thought were important considerations when making a decision about a relocation and what parents and young people thought was significant. So whilst professionals shared families' views about the importance of consistent support and planning around risk, although they didn't often have alternative plans, there were overlaps also between professionals' concerns about placement availability and families' views about the qualities of placements. But by talking with young people and families about their experiences of relocation, we got a deeper understanding of the circumstances in which they were really thought to be helpful and those in which they weren't. And that included, I guess, most centrally, the importance of communication and collaboration around the decision to relocate, and also the supporting and maintaining of those important relationships. So there's so many more examples from the data that I could have shared with you, but we don't have the time, but I can share links to the full reports at the end as well. Okay, so finally, we wanted to understand how these views about effective conditions for relocations sort of related to the impact that relocations were thought to have on safety. So we looked at what participants said about the impact of relocations on physical, relational and emotional safety. We got a very, very mixed picture. So 10 participants shared that relocations resulted in an overall increase in safety. But interestingly, at the same time, every single participant reported a range of negative impacts alongside this, including negative impacts on relationships, negative impacts on mental health and mental well-being, including isolation, self-harm, and for 3 young people, suicidal ideation. So we'll just break it down for a second: physical safety, relational safety, psychological safety. So a significant number of young people, parents and professionals, as I said, reported an overall increase in physical safety. However, they also indicated, this is 9 participants, that relocations hadn't negated the risk or addressed the vulnerability to harm. And whilst 2 professionals and 2 young people explained how physical safety had increased through disrupting abusive relationships, 3 professionals and 1 young person described how young people have been introduced to new and in some cases markedly more harmful abusive relationships and locations because of the relocation. And whilst 1 young person and 3 professionals described a reduction in missing episodes which supported their physical safety, 3 professionals and 1 young person reported a persistence of and an increase in missing episodes in the placement due to the pools of supportive relationships back home and also abusive relationships that hadn't been disrupted. In terms of relational safety, again, an ambiguous picture really emerged about the impact of relocations on relationships. So for some interviewees, relocations had supported existing relationships with friends and family. So just having that time out meant that when they did have contact, they were able to start improving relationships. But many more young people and other participants shared a variety of disruptive and painful impacts on really important familial and peer relationships. So 2 young people, 1 parent and 4 professionals described how the relationship between the young person and the new carer supported safety through trust building and boundary setting. Yet simultaneously, 7 professionals shared that concerns about the breakdown of supportive relationships were impacting young people and their relationships with existing professional networks. 3 young people described how the placement introduced them to new friends that supported their safety. That was like in the placement or in the area where the placement was. But professionals, young people and parents also shared that having to form new relationships and new friendships led them to feeling unsafe in their new environments. And whilst 3 professionals described how the placement introduced young people to risky relationships, parents, young people and professionals explained that the relocation had also disrupted risky relationships, contributing to their safety. So very mixed picture. In terms of psychological safety, so participants' views on the overall impact of relocations on psychological safety were also very mixed. So 7 professionals and 2 young people described a positive impact on the young person's psychological well-being. 3 young people reported a mixed picture, and 4 professionals, 1 parent described how the young person's mental health hadn't improved or had significantly deteriorated. And complicating this picture, when asked about the specific consequences of relocations on psychological well-being, professionals, parents and young people only described negative consequences. And these included the impact of compounded losses, so losses of relationships with professionals, losses of relationships with family members, losses of education, school friends, feelings of rejection and isolation, experiences of trauma that were caused by the placement. So in some cases that was the use of safe holds and restraint, or relationships with staff or other young people. Self-harm and suicidal ideation. Interviewees also reported lack of access to mental health support in the new area, and 2 young people said they weren't able to discuss their mental health concerns with any supportive adult at any point in the process. So we needed to make sense of this sort of mixed picture in the data. So we thought, well, let's take what we know about what was helpful and what wasn't helpful, and let's take what we know about the impact on safety and think about the specific conditions that support or undermine safety in a relocation. So by asking questions specifically about safety and not just risk, the data revealed the complex ways in which relocations could achieve physical safety, whilst at the same time negatively impacting emotional and relational safety if the specific conditions for effective relocations weren't met. And so the diagram, which is small, I appreciate, and we can circulate a better version, amalgamates this data and suggests the conditions which undermine or support safety. So as you can see from the diagram, you've got overall safety, which is composed of physical, relational and psychological safety. And for each of those types of safety, there are conditions that undermine or that contribute to that form of safety. So if we're making decisions about a relocation and we're wanting to make effective plans that really account for the range of harms associated with relocating adolescents, then we need to be considering that the conditions are in place that are going to support all these different types of safety for the young person, so that physical safety isn't being undermined by risks to psychological safety, risks to relationships. Okay. So we wanted to produce something really practical and useful for professionals, for young people and for parents and carers to use when you're navigating a decision about a relocation. So we created a resource that I believe Sharon has circulated, but I'll pop it in the chat in a minute as well. So the resource lays out some key things to consider when thinking about whether or not to relocate a young person. And I think it's particularly useful for IROs. And this is a resource that has a front page, but it also has a page specifically for professionals, specifically for young people, and specifically for parents and carers, and they're to be used together. So the resource should be shared with young people and parents, and there's a joint agreement on the front page of the resource for all involved around identifying a trusted adult for the young person. That can be anyone within the sort of who's involved in the decision making. Making sure there's a mechanism in place for meaningful joint decision making around the relocation with the parent carer where appropriate with the young person, and around the joint use of the resources so that they work with each other. So it would be that each separate party would have their page of the resource and that it would be used together collaboratively when making a decision about the relocation. So yeah, as Sharon said at the start, we're going to have some time in a minute just on your own have a look at the resource for 5 minutes, and some of you might have looked at it already. And then we'll have some chance for questions. So questions about the presentation, about the research, but also questions about the resources or feedback about the resources as well, and how you think you might use them. Before we get to that, I just want to tell you about some of the recommendations we made at the end of the research project, and one of those was a recommendation to NIROMP as well. So the first set of recommendations we made were to Department for Education. So we recommended that the DFE work with ADCS to establish the best route for oversight of the number of children placed in out of area care due to extrafamilial harm and any potential variance in these figures. And this should be used to guide commissioning and planning decisions locally and nationally. We made recommendations to Ofsted as well. So we recommended that Ofsted identify ways to examine the use of out of area placements in response to extrafamilial harm during relevant inspections, paying particular attention to whether children's social care and their partners have oversight of the numbers of young people placed out of area, and whether there's a strategy around relocating adolescents, whether there are alternative options in place and that they're being resourced, that there is support in place for young people who are relocated, and that significant and appropriate consideration is given to how we transition young people back out of area placements. And then finally, we made a recommendation to NIROMP in discussion with Sharon that you disseminate the securing safety resources. So that's exactly what we're doing today. And that members, if they like to, apply them in their practice as IROs when reviewing care plans associated and related to extrafamilial harm. And as part of this, if NIROMP could identify if any members are interested in establishing an interest group, a special interest group around extrafamilial harm, so that we can think about the efficacy of these resources, but also just areas for practice support for IROs and conference chairs who are dealing with adolescents who are exposed to extrafamilial risk. And I believe Sharon will say something more about that special interest group at the end. So that is a long time to listen. I appreciate you listening to all of that. And I will stop sharing. And I think if we just take, I'll put the resources in the chat. If we just take 5 minutes till 20 past, just having a look through the resources, they're not long. And then we'll come back together for a 10-minute discussion, and I'll take any questions or feedback. So let me just.
Okay, let's come back then, shall we? So I note that Jason has put in the comment thread there, excellent resources, really visual and easy to read. Yeah, lovely plain language. Yeah, brilliant. So thanks so much, Lauren. Really, really helpful presentation. Let's open the floor then. Some of you will no doubt have questions. Others will have comments. Open floor. Views, thoughts, ideas, experiences. Feel free to just turn your mic off and come in. Jeremy, come in, Jeremy.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, very thoughtful, and we often go to these things and you don't hear new stuff, but this is absolutely an exception, so thank you. I was interested in sort of reasons why the young people are placed outside the area, because in my experience, it's almost like you're looking for a placement away from home and you haven't got much choice about placing locally. Now, I'm from the Thames Valley, where we are, I know it's an expensive area and an awful lot of the children's homes are not here. But did you sort of look into those sorts of things to work out how many were just placed away by default rather than through deliberate decision?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for the feedback. That's good to hear as well. That's what the point of the research is, after all. Makes you feel like you're not just in your ivory tower as an academic. No, that's brilliant. That is a question that we always get asked, and a really important question about whether is it just a matter of placement availability. And what I would say is that whilst availability of placements was one of the drivers that were identified in the first phase of the research, in those local areas where they had the highest levels of relocation, so the 10 to 25%, they all identified that whilst placement availability might have been a factor, they were primarily relocating those young people because of escalating physical risks. So the inability to manage the escalating risk to that young person locally. And so that was the major driver identified by all of those higher relocating local authorities. So I think placement availability plays a role, but the management of physical risk to young people and the extent to which those were acutely escalating was identified in all of those local authorities. And for those of the higher rates of relocation, moving the young person, physically moving them away from that physical risk, was seen as an essential sort of tool in addressing the risk, even though all the other sort of possible complications around that were also identified. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
That's brilliant. And we have, sorry, not sure who came first, but we've got Claire Pritchard.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to kind of come in because I've had several cases recently, and as a IRO, often the placement has happened before my involvement. And I'm finding a lot of young people who are at risk at the moment are getting placed out of London. And it seems almost that this level of thinking about the plan hasn't taken place before. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. Let's get them out, let's remove them from the risk. And in my experience, it's becoming harder to get them back. And the cases that I'm thinking of at the moment, there hasn't been much benefit about moving them. School very disruptive. You've got transfer of CAMS, which is often really difficult. Parents can't get to see their children. And then there's a lack of support the other side with the parents. So the rehabilitation plan, if that is the plan, so I'm finding it more and more challenging to get this thinking, and I think the resources that you've shared today would be really helpful to use before the review itself, and then actually revisit it during the review and almost have it as a, okay, let's think, and then bring possibly the following review forward so we can say, okay, how have we moved on this? So I just wanted to say thanks, it's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Clem. Thanks for sharing that experience as well. And I guess it's echoed in a lot of the data that we collected. And I think one idea we had for the resources as well that they used a panel when decisions been made at panel, but also that social workers would be using them in those earlier stages with conversations with families and young people around options. But I think, like you identified, where the alternatives aren't there, local authorities are a bit stuck, really. And so that's why we wanted to land some of our recommendations also at a policy level as well, in terms of thinking around provision and resource for local areas. So thank you, Claire, for sharing that.
Thanks, Claire. So we've got a number of people wanting to make comments or ask questions here. So we've got Eddie, and then I think, Faisal, and then Marion, and then Marianne, and then Christine. So, Eddie.
I mean, I'm kind of an IRO independent chair from Lincolnshire, and I kind of wondered if the profile of those, the higher percentage local authorities were kind of mainly kind of smaller areas in many ways, many kind of maybe inner city kind of boroughs and things like that. Because I suppose in Lincolnshire's such a big area, you can kind of move somebody 50 miles without kind of moving them out of area as such, really. But I mean, it still creates many of the same problems over that 50 miles. But it would mean that technically, I suppose, that the numbers are moved out of area is much kind of smaller, apart from, I suppose, those young people who go into kind of maybe secure accommodation where they're just, I mean, there is one in Lincolnshire, but again, it's the availability of those is kind of few and far between, and they can end up being scattered all over the country.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. So we had two that had the highest levels, so around about a quarter of all young people. One was an inner city borough, and one was a much larger local authority. How do I describe where it was? Outside of any of the major cities, semi-rural location. Yeah, variation there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to bring in Faisal.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a child protection chair, and I've been in the entire hamlet for a very, very long time. And my experience is families don't particularly want children to be taken into care and placed anywhere. They sometimes come up with their own solution. And one of the solution is they would want to send them overseas to maybe, where they come from, like, in Taramlet, it'll be Bangladesh mainly. What's your thought on that, sort of relocating children to really as far as Bangladesh? And I don't know if there's any kind of research or done anything where children are relocated overseas and how that is managed.
Thanks, Faisal. Yeah, so we didn't collect data on children who were placed out of seas, although anecdotally, in the case files that we've reviewed in other areas of our research programme, we did come across, as you all know, many cases where parents are considering maybe for the summer or for a short period of time, sending a young person to live with family abroad to give them that break. I don't know if there's any specific research on children being sent abroad to families, but I'll certainly have a look. But I think it probably poses some of the same problems, which is how do we bring them back? Because what local authorities were telling us overall is that it provides a break either for the young person or for the local authority in what is sort of firefighting, crisis management. But often the planning around creating the safety in the context in the local area either stops or local authorities just don't know what to do about decreasing the risk and bringing the young person back, which I think is really valid even just to acknowledge that. And so I guess the same issue would arise is you know, how do we decrease the risk in the locality in order for that young person to be able to safely brought home and the risks not to just crop up again.
I guess, you know, trying to kind of balance it out. What I'm thinking is, you know, there are obviously certain advantages of if they, let's say, a Bangladeshi young person getting into trouble and all that, and is relocated to Bangladesh, there are definitely significant number of areas of needs that will be met. For example, the culture, the religion, possibly the education and all that. At the same time, there is a lot of other things that might be missing. And you know, I'm thinking about myself when I was a social worker, and many years ago when I had to place this young Bangladeshi person, relocate him to Lincolnshire, and even to this day, I think about it. What have I done? You know, I think was that a big mistake? Because there he was in this placement, no other Bangladeshi person there. The food, everything is just. I think, you know, I've turned his world upside down. And you know, it's, you know, and if the parents, if they had their way, they probably would have chosen to send him to Bangladesh, and that probably would have been a better choice than sending him to Lincolnshire.
Thanks, Faisal, and thanks for sharing that. And I'm a registered social worker too, and I bet there's not one social worker in this room who hasn't made a decision that they look back on and think, well, was it the best decision? I guess it's just probably important to flag at this stage that the findings from this research aren't do or don't relocate, but to consider the conditions in which a relocation is most likely to be effective and feel safe for a young person. Yeah, thank you for your comments. I'm aware of the time because we were going to break. Questions left. Yeah.
Would you mind if we just work through with the questions? Because is that okay? Number of people here. So yeah. Marion, come in, and then we'll go to Marianne.
Yes, I mean, I thought it was very interesting comments that have been made, and I think there's the whole question about, like, well, where's the pressure coming from? And prior to coming on to today's web conference, I was reading about the work that needs to be done with young people about, I think, like, that really assessing, doing peer assessment to assess how can we protect them if they're danger. And it seems that we're still in the early stage of really kind of assessing and kind of thinking, well, how can we kind of take them away from the danger and build on safe relationship? And I also had a lot of people talking about the pressure from the police, which I've kind of experienced that. It's like, oh, you know, it's just young persons causing so much trouble. And it would be much better if they were moved out of borough. But with the social media, county lines, what we're finding is that actually we're removing them from London, because actually London has gotten better about protecting young people, because the problem has often shifted to places like Lincoln and other that's where, so you could have taken them out of the fire in London, out of the frying pan in London, it can be in certain instances, and placing them in the fire because of the shift of county lines from somewhere like London to the rural areas. So I think there's that kind of challenge there. And interestingly, you know, talking about relocating young people from England to other countries, I think this has been an issue for, like, maybe Nigerian parents, Somalian parents. And I actually, a long time ago, went to a very interesting play that was done about it. I think it was at the Lyric Theatre. It was about kind of a young person being relocated, and the story being told from the young person's point of view, not being realized that he thought he was going for a holiday, and not realizing that, you know, his parents were going to live without him because they'd had enough of his behavior. So the play ends with him being in total shock that he's not going to be coming home. He's going to be staying here. So, and I think that perspective about what it means for that young people. And I think one of my young person was totally disgusted. She was relocated. Like, you've placed me somewhere and all I can see is sheep.
We heard a few comments like that. Yeah. Thanks for the comment. And I think and I guess if you're working in a local area where you're seeing parents wanting to take young people out of the area because of risks, I guess it's an indication that there are local risks that, you know, really aren't being managed, and who do we need to have around the table to think about that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to bring Marion in next. Great.
Hi there. I'm a child protection reviewing officer in Brighton, but also have an IRO role as well with some young people. And I think I just wanted to mention a young man that I worked with where, although it wasn't perfect by any means, I think we probably got as good an outcome as we could have expected for him. And I think what worked, he was on a child protection plan for a good 18 months, being exploited in terms of drugs. And I'd been kind of lured into dealing drugs from probably about the age 12, 13. His family were very on board with the initial child protection conference. They were so welcoming of professional network around them. They'd been struggling with this for a long time, not knowing what to do. And we tried all the safety measures, tried to get them into education, tried to get them into kind of programmes that would get them interested in boxing, or also a variety of things to try and get them away from this group. A lot of his actions he didn't quite think through the consequences of. So getting him more and more heavily involved, he was asked to hold ammunition for the gang, which he held in the house, and ended up with gang members threatening his mum and his sister in the house. And him and one of his pals stole a gun from, and then by that point we've got to get him out of here for his physical safety. We've tried everything else. Of course, parents were really distressed to think about that and upset about it, but also acknowledging actually this has potential to be life or death, not just for him, but for other family members. So they did agree to it. He went a long way away. And, you know, I would say that he wasn't happy there. He was on his own with two carers, and they did shifts. There was two. They stayed there with him in a kind of. I went up and did a review up there. He wasn't happy there, and he was still being contacted on his mobile phone by the dealers. However, good work was done with him by those professionals there. And the reason parents agreed to the plan was because it gave mum, the parents had separated, but it gave mum the opportunity to sell her house and move herself to another area, get herself sorted out there, get into another house, and then have him back home in another area with safeguards in place there. So I don't think there is a perfect way to do this, but I think having the child protection bit around him to begin with when he was younger, and that she trusted the adults, the professionals, as did Dad, they trusted the professionals to be all with her, working together with her, trying to get an education package for him while he was away as best we could. Know what happened to him when then they moved. He could well have got involved again somewhere else, but I think that was the key, working with family. And I think I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying, is about family trusting the professionals around them, even though we couldn't quite get that trust from the young man himself.
Yeah, and it sounds like lots of the things that came out of the data that we collected in terms of parents involved and on board, and that effect, you know, that being contributing to the effectiveness of the relocation, really came across there. I guess that's it. It's not a one size fits all. And, you know, we also came across young people who really wanted to be relocated, and the local authority felt they weren't resourced to do that. The window cleaner's just turned up, so he's literally here at the window in front of me. But yeah, no, thank you for that comment.
Lauren, could I just quickly come in? So I didn't work with Lauren on this project, but I did do a subsequent piece of work looking at the data with Carleen Fermin, who leads the programme. And we were specifically looking at relationships within relocation. And just linking to that point you just made, Marion, that's a really helpful little case example of what we found was that very often when a young person was relocated, what happened was the social worker found it really hard to know which relationships to prioritise. So the focus would sometimes go towards the young person in placement, but that would drop, but then that would kind of mean that the relationships with the family and the focus that had been with the family might drop off. And the example you gave was, you know, a brilliant example of practice where it sounds like it was possible to still hold on to the work with the family whilst the young person was going away, so that both the relationships in both contexts could be thought about, so they could be brought back together. And I think that's often the real challenge for social workers, to know how to hold those two things in mind and keep on building the strengths there.
And I think, I mean, we did support parents to travel up to, they travelled, I think they went monthly each, so every fortnight one of them was travelling up to Inverness, stay overnight and having a weekend with him.
Yeah, great example, Marion. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And I just want to move to Christine. Christine, you've got your hands up. Great. Want to come in, Christine?
Oh, sorry. Right. Hello, everybody. I'm Christine Whisker. I'm an IRO from Hammersmith and Fulham. I am hearing impaired and very much dependent on the captions that come up at the bottom of the screen. So please bear with me. I think, just to add on to what people were saying, I was very much in agreement with what Marion said, in terms of, I think there's a misconception about moving children or young people immediately from London or the bigger cities. I think it's really important for us to assess what the risk is. If there is a risk to life, which there have been with a number of young people I've worked with, and we have needed to move them out for that safety, and sometimes their families as well. That's a different sort of matter. But I think a lot of young people are recruited into the county lines, and if you know more about that, you understand that they're actually not doing that work in London and the big cities. They're going out to the rural areas and the coastal towns. So it's about also, I think, as you said, Marion, more in London and some of the bigger cities, probably there's more resources. So within Hammersmith and Fulham, we've had some very sad situations of young people being killed in gang-related incidents and in the surrounding boroughs. And what we're learning from that is we've got some really good services in terms of a family assist team, and they've just put a lot of resource into a gangs unit, a specialist gangs unit, which includes social workers, police, youth workers and everything. Those sort of projects actually being put into different areas would probably be much more beneficial than moving children out. As you say, we sometimes move them to areas there's no CAMS resources, or there's long waiting lists, there's no youth clubs, there's no, so actually trying to keep them where they are within their family unit or close to their family unit with some very specialist work in is really important. And I think also this is where the team around the child meetings come in, because I don't feel it's just like the IRO agreeing with that. I feel that actually I need to be part of a group that know this child and family really well, and we make that assessment of risk and decisions about accommodation together, so that it's actually a joint thing, not just, well, this is all they've got available. And I know sometimes we do have to firefight and there are emergencies, but then we should all know when they're moving, where they're, what are the, and discuss that where possible, because there are a lot of people who know that young person much better than I do, who are actually not consulted. So, I think it's really important. The other thing I wanted to pick up was in your presentation about a parent who said that they hadn't realised the care order was until they were 18. And I think, again, that's an area we generally don't always work with parents on very well, in terms of, yes, it can be until they're 18, but care orders are in place for protection at that time. And I've seen actually a number of families who have been able to turn their lives around, and the children or young people on care orders have returned home, or even whilst they've been on the care order and living away, the parents are very much involved in the care plan. So I would want more work to be done with parents around what a care order means and how they can still be part of that work with the child. So they were just my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Really helpful comments. I guess just based on what you just say, and I guess like maybe the take-home message from this particular piece of research is it's less around whether you relocate or don't relocate and the findings indicating which is better, but sort of, are we in the business just of managing risk, or are we in the business of creating safety in situations in which young people are going to thrive? And I think even in those circumstances where there were serious threats to life, if considerations around creating safety for the young person, both in the local area and in the new area, hadn't been considered, then we would see they were significantly undermining attempts to keep them physically safe, whether they were going missing from the placement, or just returning to the local area. So yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your experiences with me as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to swiftly move us on then, if that's okay. I'm going to cut out the little break and move us to Dr. Rachel Owens from the Contextual Safeguarding team. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I've chipped in already a little bit. So yeah, I'm Rachel Owens. I am social work practice advisor for the Contextual Safeguarding team. And we've been working, as Lauren was saying, all of our research is done in collaboration with practitioners, with local authority sites, children's services, and I've been working over the past 3 years to embed contextual safeguarding in local systems. And one of the partners that we've been working with in Devon have very kindly agreed to share some of their experiences of particularly embedding contextual safeguarding into the IRO role. So as Sharon explained at the beginning, Gary Sanders, our colleague from Devon, was planning to come and deliver a presentation today, unfortunately has been unable to, but has very kindly recorded it. So I'm actually extremely nervous about my technology responsibilities here. I'm going to try and share my screen, but I'll tell you a little bit about Gary before I do. He is the Quality Insurance Reviewing and Safeguarding Service Manager at Devon, and he has been involved in developing a range of assessment and panels and tools that can be used to address extrafamilial harm. He says in the presentation he's got 20 minutes. It's actually 45 minutes long, so and there's no way of cutting it down because it's already recorded, but it's a very interesting presentation that ranges across the work that they're doing, and I hope you'll enjoy it. And I am going to share now, and I hope it works. Beginning.
Today, but I just wanted to kind of flag up that it's really important when we think about the features of extrafamilial harm and contextual risk that we understand that within the context of adolescent development, and that we see the adolescent relationship as an opportunity for engagement and an opportunity to harness the potential of adolescence to create safety and well-being. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the literature, but as we know, adolescence is a period of significant and rapid change across all of the developmental domains, and this provides both opportunities for engagement and also challenges in terms of how we as adults navigate that space to enhance our ability to engage with young people effectively. It kind of reminds us that we need to continue to engage families and their carers, because although their role is changing, they will have still a significant role and contribution to make to the experience of adolescence. But also we need to more readily engage young people and their peer networks around them, because we know that during the period of adolescence it is peer influence that is most likely to shape, both in a positive or negative way, the experience of the adolescent identity formation. And finally, we just also need to remind ourselves that risk-taking is a natural and normal part of the adolescent journey. That our planning around young people is not to eradicate risk, but enable young people to experience and take manageable opportunities to experience and experiment in terms of navigating their space and journey to adulthood. Again, this slide isn't telling you anything that you don't already know, but it's just to reinforce that the role of an independent safeguarding and reviewing officer is really significant in terms of contributing to improving outcomes for young people. And that within those roles, as they're kind of set out within the IRO handbook, that you have a role in terms of ensuring that young people's wishes and feelings are heard and understood, and where possible, effectively incorporated in planning. And that you're there to hold professionals accountable to ensure that they are acting as effective and appropriate corporate parents through the delivery of effective care plans. What contextual safeguarding invites you to do in addition to this is to ensure that wider partners within the wider geography and community are also contributing both directly and indirectly to the safety and protection of young people. At this juncture, it might be helpful for those of you that aren't familiar with Devon's adolescent safety framework to kind of give a bit of context. But I would say at this point that if you'd like to find out more about the adolescent safety framework and Devon's contextual response to meeting the needs of adolescents at risk of extrafamilial harm, please do visit our Devon Children and Families website, where there will be a portal into all of the information that I'm referring to today. But in kind of summary, Devon created the Adolescent Safety Framework in recognition that adolescents face different risks within their community, and that these often extend beyond their families. That the conventional welfare mechanisms were primarily in place to respond to familial harm, and yet negated the issue that many young people face risk from non-related individuals or from kind of more organised networks of both peers or unsafe adults that may be non-related. We also kind of recognised, as I've indicated earlier, that we need to understand young people not just within the context of their families, but also in the spaces and relationships in which they operate. So thinking about a young person both within their school setting, within their wider community setting, and within their peer relationships and dynamics. We also recognise that we were just missing opportunities to influence and reduce risk, because what the research literature clearly indicates to us is that it is through engagement and relationships that we are likely to make the most kind of effective inroads in promoting change and safety for young people, and that this is best achieved through collaborative relationships with welfare partners and partners that extend beyond the statutory sector, so that we can really offer true guardianship capacity within our kind of wider social and community networks. The framework is designed to kind of support both professionals, families and young people to feel safer. And it does that by streamlining a number of kind of welfare processes and activities that are already undertaken by professionals within both social care, early help and the third sector, but brings them under kind of one umbrella with a shared language and understanding. It also is designed to improve clarity about how to respond to contextual risk and the harm that may kind of emanate from exploitation activity. And what we have found in terms of following our implementation, and we've now been kind of using the framework for 3 years, that it reduces anxiety within the professional network in terms of its kind of understanding and response to exploitation. And in terms of cost benefits, has enabled us to be kind of more resource effective in terms of delivery of provision. And kind of importantly, the framework is designed to make measurable difference to the life and experience of young people within the Devon geography, and to make them feel kind of safer in the spaces, places and relationships in which they are navigating through their adolescence. So the key principles of the framework, as I've already identified, are that they are rooted in adolescent development and informed by trauma narrative and understanding, that we see young people as assets and resources that we need to engage and harness, that we are there to promote supportive relationships between young people, their families, peers and communities, and that we invite the opportunity for trusted relationships with key practitioners that can act as conduits for services to work alongside young people. That it's important that we have a holistic approach to understanding young people and the risks they face, and within that we mean being realistic about young people's lived experience. And the final principle is to ensure that services are accessible to young people and to professionals as they navigate this space. I'm conscious that I'm whizzing through this quite quickly, but just to give you an overview of the framework itself, the framework is made up of 3 different pathways essentially. So the individual pathway, which is focused on responding to extrafamilial harm or exploitation through individual planning around young people. And that can be achieved either through a Safe for Me child in care meeting, a Safe for Me plus child protection meeting, or a Safe for Me SIN or TAF. The focus of the meetings will use the same kind of premise as those existing meetings from a conventional welfare stance, but the focus of the meetings will look primarily at how to enhance a child's well-being within the context of their environment, relationships and the places and spaces they operate. Above the individual pathway is what we would call our context pathway, which looks at how we intervene with different contexts in the hope that it will influence and create a climate of safety for young people in the places and spaces they operate. In Devon, we use the neighbourhood conference mechanism, the peer group conference mechanism, the school context conference, the ASBAT around kind of antisocial behaviour, and also the complex strategy mechanism around organised and complex abuse. These meetings do not focus on individual safeguarding responses, but look at kind of more systemic and relational mechanisms of enhancing a young person's safety through organisational change or environmental change. And the third pathway is the strategic element in terms of making sure there is coherence around the approach to both exploitation and also in terms of adolescence. And so our adolescent and exploitation strategy will be kind of overseen by our Devon Children and Families Partnership in collaboration with our community safety partnerships with the Safer Devon, and this is kind of held together by the work that's been undertaken by Dr. Colleen Furman, and the Contextual Safeguarding Network, and some of the principles outlined within research in practice. Different local authorities and agencies will have interpreted the call to responding to extrafamilial harm differently. There will be different frameworks, different services, different approaches, different mechanisms in order to tackle the issue of exploitation harm. However, at the centre of a contextual approach are 5 key values. And I think these values kind of permeate, I hope, many aspects of social work, permeate the role of the independent reviewing officer, but at the centre of all the work that we do around contextual safeguarding is the importance of having collaborative relationships and working with professionals, children and young people, and to extend those relationships beyond pre-existing welfare relationships to include wider communities. That it's important that we have an ecological awareness that considers both the context in which families and young people operate and how this is shaped by more strategic, systemic inequalities and adverse trauma. That a contextual approach is rooted in a rights-based engagement approach which seeks to protect young people's rights and promote a human rights perspective. And very much this is central to the role of an IRO, that it is the rights of young people and the rights to good quality care that you are continually advocating and promoting. A contextual approach is a strength-based approach, and as I said previously, is based on the premise that we see young people as assets and agents of their own change, and that we are there to support and help them navigate that space by recognising that it is through restorative and strength-based conversations that we can achieve change and maintain a position of hopefulness. And that our approaches are evidence informed, so they are proportionate and based in the reality of real life. That we are there to offer solution-focused opportunities to improved lived experience for young people, families and communities, but it has to be achievable, realistic and smart. And that's what is at the very centre of the work of IROs in terms of effective kind of care planning and quality assurance activity. So I'm going to attempt to very succinctly summarise what contextual safeguarding is, as I've been kind of referring to it throughout this presentation. Hopefully some of you may be familiar with this image. It's an image from the album cover from Nirvana, probably kind of reveals my kind of age and musical tastes. But I just want you to think about this image represents the conventional child protection, child welfare system. It's orientated around the child, thinks about the child within their own developmental framework, and will often make attribution to the ability of a caregiver to provide care and support, and may then give some thought to some of the environmental features in and around them. So in this context, when we're kind of making a risk assessment around this situation, we might be thinking about the child's age, developmental ability to swim, their ability to breathe in terms of some kind of physiology. We may be thinking about whether there is concern around the neglect of a safe adult, which appears not to be nearby, and that we may suggest that there is some environmental influence in terms of thinking about the temperature of the water. What does the money mean on the kind of the fishing line? Well, a contextual safeguarding approach is it encourages us to take a broader 180-degree kind of turnaround perspective, to think about more widely the influence of the ecology and the context around the young person. So the young person is still very central to kind of thinking and planning, but the interventions may be focused on how we influence, disrupt, or shape the characteristics in and around that young person in the hope of creating safety. And so just to keep with the example that I've given, is that rather than removing the baby from the water, we might target the shark. And the shark may, in this instance, represent an exploitative network. How do we use civil powers, legal powers to look at disruption of that risk? And similarly, if we see the dolphin as an asset, so for example, in this context, maybe a community resource, a youth worker, how do we utilize that dolphin in order to help create safety, to help that child swim away from the risk of the shark? And similarly, if we look at the environment, so the ocean bed with the shipwreck, how do we tackle that place and space in order to create safety and eradicate the risk of the child gaining injury from the debris in the seabed? So a contextual safeguarding approach, just to reaffirm, still has the child at the centre, but its interventions are focused on how to influence and shape characteristics around that young person, hoping by changing that context that it will create safety for that child and other children who may find themselves within a similar context. So the independent reviewing officer has a central and pivotal role in supporting contextual safeguarding responses. And I would argue that in order to be an effective advocate and quality assurance agent for that young person, that you need to have confidence in understanding the different forms of exploitation and extrafamilial harm, that you need to be willing to co-create and explore with young people and their families their understanding of risk and harm. And this can be achieved from our experience in Devon through utilising restorative and systemic approaches. It's important to recognise that early intervention within care planning is going to be the most effective in diverting young people from the increasing risk of extrafamilial harm and will improve engagement. But it's important that you encourage the multi-agency and professionals to maintain a welfare approach and not to kind of fall back on seeing young people as responsible for their exploitation, or that seeing that the criminal justice route is the only avenue in terms of creating safety. But as an independent reviewing officer, it's being able to guide the network to recognise those reachable or critical moments of engagement. And the research tells us that those moments are often at points of crisis. So either at the point where school exclusion is being considered, the point of arrest, a missing episode, or a hospital admission following injury, that it's those moments where young people are often feeling the most scared or the most vulnerable, that we need to think about how we are engaging them in order to try and shift the paradigm, to shift the trajectory. That you should be the personification of the values of contextual safeguarding that I kind of highlighted to you earlier, and that plans should value the use of trusted relationships in their formulation and delivery. And what I mean by that is sometimes we have a tendency to bombard young people with multiple services, and that this in itself can feel threatening, intimidating, and overwhelming. And that the most effective contextual plans are where we've used one or two trusted relationships as a conduit of resource and services, so that the young person can focus on one or two key central relationships, and that the delivery of their plan is coordinated or delivered by those individuals rather than multiple. that it's important that within the IRO role, you are the one that maintains the contextual lens, that you make the link between both individual and contextual responses. So in Devon, the IRO was both responsible for, say, individual Safer Me meetings, but also chairing a peer group conference or a school-based conference where that young person may indirectly being referred to, and how you keep that interconnectivity between those layers of approaches that will all in combination contribute to improved safety and protection for young people. And your job is also about being proportionate. And as I said, when we talked about adolescent development, normalising the adolescent experience by holding some of that risk and professional anxiety and uncertainty. In Devon, we found it useful to use a kind of positive youth development framework to think about how we embody aspects of participation and possibility. And so we have adopted the approach of using the 6 C's as a way of benchmarking whether our approaches are seeing young people through the lens of possibility and engagement rather than purely focusing on risk. So within all care plans, we ask, how are we supporting competence? And what we mean by competence is a child's social and behavioural ability. How are we supporting their connection? So their ability to form relationships with people and place. How are we developing elements of their character? And what I mean by that is in terms of their kind of value base, their sense of integrity, their sense of wrong and right. How are we supporting aspects of their confidence? So how do we develop self-esteem and self-efficacy? How are we modelling and championing and demonstrating care and compassion? So how are we supporting them to develop humane values and empathy and a sense of social justice? And how are we ensuring young people are making meaningful and purposeful contributions to their decision making and agency? And I just think this kind of very simple youth development framework is really helpful in terms of you as IROs navigating conversations that ensure they are being as holistic as possible and as participatory in terms of their approach. So in Devon, alongside conventional child in care meetings or child protection meetings, we have what we call Safer Me meetings. So you can have a Safer Me child in care meeting or a Safer Me plus child protection conference. These meetings are focused where there is identified need around exploitation or extrafamilial harm, and that the planning around the young person is primarily focused on how do we enhance their safety and protection within that context. These meetings have kind of set agendas which you can access through the website, but essentially the premise of them is that they promote trusted relationships, they foster resilience and self-determination, so the young person may chair their meeting but are very much kind of involved in the discussion and the formulation of any plan, that it kind of promotes the recognition of positive behaviours and normative risk taking, so that it's not all about what the young person is deemed to be doing wrong, but it promotes pro-social norms and opportunities for positive social engagement. And as we've kind of indicated through the kind of practice model, fosters self-efficacy and positive identity, and a belief that things can be better, that it is full of hope, that there is kind of resolution and recovery, and that there is co-creation and collaboration with young people to respond to harm outside of the home. And so within Devon, for example, in the Child Protection Case Conference Forum, we've added an additional child protection category as harm outside of the home, which we have found has been more inclusive and less shaming and blaming towards the family, young person or social network. And that we recognise that any plans that are put together are based on interventions that need to focus on the young people within the context they live beyond their family. So we're not focused on how do we enhance parenting capacity, but how do we enhance guardianship capacity? How are we enhancing kind of social and community investment around the young person identified? So when thinking about a Safe for Me child in care meeting, which is a individual contextual welfare response, attendance at the meeting will be considered to include wider stakeholders beyond conventional safeguarding partners. So thinking about, is the young person engaged with a particular youth activity, a particular organisation in the third sector that may be able to contribute to that plan. That the agenda will consider what are the current concerns, risks and vulnerabilities, what strengths and assets have been identified within that assessment of need. We'll introduce the idea of context weighting and scaling. So for those of you that are familiar with the signs of safety approach, we'll use a scaling system similar to that, but also contextual weighting. So trying to understand where is the risk kind of emanating from, and the questions we use for scaling and context weighting are focused around what is the most important issue and where is the greatest risk, and that will determine what contextual response is deemed as the most appropriate, whether that be an individual response or a contextual response through, say, a school context conference or a peer group conference. And also within the context weighting, we'll ask the question, what's going to have the greatest impact in terms of creating safety for a young person? There is then a safety plan or intervention plan that's put together, and the plan will consider what other contextual approaches might be required in addition to the individual plan. Questions within the meeting are focused on increasing safety within the social environment beyond the family. And consideration should be given to how and whether the context itself can be made safer for all young people and not just the young person who is at the focus of this particular meeting. Because the idea of a contextual safeguarding approach is that it should be the context that is made safer, because then this will indirectly improve safety and well-being for a wider group of young people. So very briefly, I just kind of want to remind you about the use of emotional literacy as a tool for intervention. So recognizing how we engage young people at an emotional level, and that it is through emotion and relationship-based conversations where we are able to model effective understanding around emotion and cognition that we are most likely to effect change. And so very often within a contextual kind of framework, we often think what resources are available to mitigate against that risk. The resource very often is the relationship and the conversations about experience, feelings and emotion that are going to enable conversations that make change. When we're thinking beyond individual responses and we think about contextual responses, these can be achieved in Devon at 3 different levels. So we can think about contextual responses that focus on the peer group, and some of those interventions may focus on parent-child support groups. So we focus on empowering caregivers and families to recognise and respond to exploitation risk. It can focus on assertive youth and community outreach to engage and model positive activities and relationships for young people. And we can also focus on disruption activity around individuals of concern, utilising disruption through both civil and criminal means. Within a school safety context, so a school-based context, we can be thinking around how assessments and interventions can influence school culture and practical environments. How we can use tools such as bystander impact, so having bystanders that are modelling and disrupting behaviour that's either deemed as pro-social or negative, and developing the knowledge and skills both of students and teachers in terms of having a more confident and mature understanding around the features of exploitation. And finally, a contextual response based around neighbourhood safety will focus on issues around how we create greater safety within environments in the community. So, for example, broadening safeguarding relationships to include safety partnerships in order to look at how we make the places and spaces within our neighbourhood safer, so that both young people and families and adults feel safer. And this is very much based on broadening stakeholder involvement to include things like shops, retail, restaurants and hotels, and developing their skills and knowledge around exploitation and welfare responses, rather than demonising or excluding young people. So finally, I want to just kind of give a bit of a practice example about how we utilise that framework for a looked after child known as Billy. And so Billy was a 15-year-old young person who was in the care of the local authority, and we had identified notable concerns around criminal exploitation in relation to his drug use and involvement in local drug supply. It had been identified within his Safe for Me assessment that there had been an increased number of missing episodes, and that he was excluded from education and wider kind of opportunities. He was reporting that he had kind of no extracurricular or wider kind of interests, that he was on the kind of fringes of peer-on-peer violence, which led to a physical assault and wounding following a particular incident, and where he was admitted to hospital for a puncture wound, and that this was therefore meaning that he was coming in increasing contact with the police and the Youth Justice Service due to criminal antisocial behaviour. What we kind of recognise is that this was impacting itself in terms of his presentation around poor mental health and self-confidence, and that he was directing a lot of abuse towards his kind of kinship carer, which was leading to the risk of placement breakdown. So with these features, the way in which we used a contextual response in and around Billy were four key components. There was an individual plan coordinated by his IRO that focused on issues relating to his relationship with his carers, his kind of mental health and emotional well-being, and some support work around his kind of substance misuse and his engagement with his yacht officer. So what would be seen as quite a conventional welfare response in order to address areas of need. But the other plans that sat alongside Billy were that he was also, and his group were managed through a peer group conference mechanism, where we identified and mapped Billy's network, and saw that some of the features identified for Billy were also emerging themes for the young people in and around him. So a support plan was utilised through a peer group conference, which introduced first of all a civil order introducing a curfew, and also restricting where some of the young people could travel to because they were associating to particular locations which were causing harm to them. That we were able to get some funding for some targeted youth outreach to try and engage the network and Billy in the kind of places and spaces where they were hanging out. And we also developed a carer parent support group, which the carer was invited to attend in order to help normalise and also build resilience for the carer. The third level for Billy was then we also convened a neighbourhood context conference in the seaside town that he was in, where we engaged kind of local hoteliers and restaurants in and around recognising the features of exploitation. And in this instance, what the Community Safety Partnership were able to do, because of the transit nature of holidaymakers coming into Devon, is that they were able to work with their local neighbourhood to develop with street pastors, people kind of walking around kind of on a Friday, Saturday night and taking young people who may be kind of hanging around in streets or kind of feeling a bit worse for wear after the influence of alcohol to safe spaces. And so there was a local kind of church centre that was used as a safe space for young people to kind of recover, have some adult supervision and influence. Alongside that, the Community Safety Partnership also did a series of kind of educative pieces of work into local high schools and primary schools to tackle emerging themes, so that we weren't kind of expanding that peer group network, and that we are diverting other young people that may have been influenced to join the group to other opportunities. And then finally, we engaged Billy's secondary school in a peer group in a school-based conference in order for the school to kind of review its own safeguarding and responses to contextual safeguarding, and to kind of have wider conversations with young people about its offer around exploitation. So first of all, it did a bit of hotspot mapping, and also revised some of its kind of extracurricular kind of options and activities for young people to explore issues around substance misuse, safe relationships, peer-on-peer harm. And so can you see that we used a variety of approaches, both through the individual and contextual pathways, in order to both contribute to Billy's safety and well-being, but also to the well-being of his peer network, his wider school community, and then his wider neighbourhood safety. And that the combination of all those features supported improved outcomes for Billy in terms of being diverted away from the criminal justice system and exploitation activity. And as we draw this presentation to a close, I'm not naive to say that this is an easy place to navigate as an IRO, that we identified a number of challenges in trying to implement such a framework and approach for our young people. So there were challenges in identifying the key stakeholders within assessment and planning, that there is always the tension between providing a framework and how you also then provide interventions in order to support the activity of the framework, that there is still the challenges of how we navigate the space of adolescence within the confines and pressures of statutory limitations. So we know, for example, that adolescence is a period that extends till 25, and that there are challenges in how we manage transitional safeguarding arrangements for many of our young people as they move into adult services or are young care leavers. That we recognise that the partnership is vast, and that making cultural change around the issues of exploitation takes time and perseverance, and this has been impacted by the disruption of COVID and how that has impacted on the profile of exploitation activity, the visibility of young people, and the capacity of services and resources to meet that need. What we've recognised in Devon is there is still a skills deficit in knowledge and confidence of practitioners to engage young people around issues of child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, and that we continue to struggle to adapt to contextual approaches to safeguarding responses, that because we are very much driven by the Children Act, that our statutory guidance does not yet fully help us or equip us in navigating that space easily, hence why there are many differential approaches to responding to contextual harm from different authorities. And that we also recognise that during adolescence, managing issues of consent and confidentiality for young people to participate within contextual responses is also a difficult area to manoeuvre. And finally, we've had to really kind of think about our investment in analytical capacity in order to inform contextual assessments around interventions. So particularly when you're trying to undertake, for example, neighbourhood or peer-based conferences, how do we ensure that we have the analytics and assessment capacity in order to make sense of the environments and relationships in which young people operate? So I am conscious that this presentation has whizzed at quite a pace, so I would just signpost you to the following resources that you might find helpful.
I thought I would finish because
Yes.
look at the video later. Yeah, thank you.
That's great, thank you. So I'm conscious we're just moving over time now. To thank all of our guest speakers, Rachel, Lauren, the Contextual Safeguarding team, a really helpful session, and to Gary, of course, for his video. We will post on via the website. I put in the chat that we are going to develop a special interest group as per the recommendations from the Contextual Safeguarding team. An invite for that will go out to me for a kind of first point of discussion around the 14th of June, 11:15 to 12:30. Information about that will be posted via the NIROMP website, and for those of you that may not be linked into those networks, perhaps because you're a conference chair that doesn't also have that dual role of RRO, have a look out for that. Otherwise, there'll also be communications via regional leads, NIROMP's regional lead. So I've put in a link there. If you're interested in getting involved, please email niromp@outlook.com, and I've also put in a link to our online contact system, so you could just drop us a note there and we'll get in contact. So last but not least, thanks for all your contributions today. Really helpful. Sorry we haven't got more time, haven't had more time for discussion, because I think there was some really rich discussion earlier. But like I say, you know, it doesn't end here. Our colleagues from the Contextual Safeguarding team will continue to liaise with them, and like I say, do get in contact if you're interested in taking this further. All right, so with that, wishing you all a great rest of day, and as soon as we possibly can, we'll share materials again via the website. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Maren. Everyone, thank you. Brilliant.
Everyone.
Thank you.